Charleston's Medical College purchased 23 enslaved individuals in February 1847 for a sum that raised eyebrows even among the city's wealthy elite, nearly triple the standard rental rate. The college provided no explanation for the premium price, and the subjects' owners asked no questions. 3 months later, all 23 were returned. 12 could walk. 7 required assistance. 4 had stopped speaking entirely. The college paid every owner in full with substantial bonuses for their silence, and one additional clause in each contract. The subjects were never to be sold within South Carolina's borders again. What happened in those 90 days remained Charleston's most carefully guarded secret until a single error during one midnight procedure set in motion events that would expose everything. Before we continue with the story of what transpired behind the locked doors of Charleston's most prestigious medical institution, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss our darkest historical tales. And leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our community of history seekers is watching from. The winter of 1847 in Charleston was unusually cold, and what happened in that basement would prove even colder still. Charleston in 1847 stood as the jewel of Southern culture and commerce, its harbor crowded with merchant vessels, and its streets lined with elegant townhouses that spoke of wealth built on rice, cotton, and human bondage. The Medical College of South Carolina, established just 20 years earlier, occupied an imposing Greek Revival building on Queen Street, where the sons of plantation owners learned the healing arts alongside poor white students seeking professional elevation. Dr. Edmund Carowway had arrived at the college 2 years prior, already carrying a controversial reputation from his time in Philadelphia. At 38, he possessed the kind of mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos, connections where others saw coincidence. His colleagues at Jefferson Medical College had found his theories about racial physiology fascinating but unprovable, at least not with the restrictions Northern society placed on medical experimentation. The South, Carowway reasoned, offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Here the law recognized enslaved people as property, subject to their owner's will. Here, science might finally answer questions that had vexed natural philosophers for centuries. The college itself occupied an uncomfortable position in Charleston society. The city's elite families sent their sons there, but they also whispered about what happened in the dissection rooms, about the bodies that arrived in the dead of night, about the screams that sometimes echoed from the basement windows. Dean Horace Ruddled maintained that all great medical advances required sacrifice, that the students needed practical experience, that the South must develop its own medical expertise rather than depend on Northern institutions. Most Charlestonians agreed, as long as they didn't look too closely at the methods. Carowway lived in modest rooms near the college, having never married despite his professional success. His colleagues found him pleasant enough in casual conversation, but noted his tendency to become obsessed with particular questions. For the past year, that question had consumed him entirely. Did the physical differences between races extend to the nervous system itself? Could pain tolerance, healing rates, and disease resistance be measured and compared scientifically? The debate over these questions raged in medical journals and scientific societies throughout the Western world. Some physicians insisted that all humans shared fundamental similarities, that apparent differences arose from circumstance rather than biology. Others, particularly in the South, argued that Providence had created distinct races with different capabilities and constitutions, that this justified the social order, that science would eventually prove what everyone could plainly see. Carowway believed he could settle the matter definitively with the right study design. He needed subjects, human subjects from different races, subjected to identical conditions so that variables could be controlled. He needed animals for comparison to establish baselines, and he needed the freedom to conduct experiments that Northern institutions would never permit. In early January 1847, he presented his proposal to Dean Ruddled in the administrator's wood-paneled office. The study would involve testing pain responses, healing rates, and disease resistance across 3 groups: enslaved Africans, monkeys imported from India, and as a control group, white subjects from the city's poorhouse. Carowway had already secured funding from 3 plantation owners interested in the practical applications. If enslaved workers truly felt less pain, it might influence medical treatment and work requirements. Ruddled listened with fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The methodology is sound," he said finally, "but we cannot use white subjects, even paupers. The community would never stand for it regardless of the scientific value. Use only the Negro subjects and the animals. If your theory is correct, the comparison should still yield meaningful data." Carowway agreed, though privately he worried about the absence of a proper control group. He spent the next month preparing his laboratory in the college basement, installing examination tables, organizing his instruments, and designing detailed observation protocols. He ordered 12 rhesus monkeys from a merchant who imported exotic animals, paying premium prices for healthy specimens of similar age and size. The enslaved subjects came from various sources. Plantation owners sent individuals they considered troublesome or excess to their labor needs, seeing the study as an opportunity to earn rental fees while disposing of problems. Others came from the city itself. House servants accused of theft, field hands injured and now considered less valuable, a woman who tried to run away twice. Carowway paid $1.50 per subject for a 3-month term with no guarantee of their condition. At the end, he gave each a number rather than using their names, recording only basic information: approximate age, sex, visible health status, and origin. Number 7 was a woman in her mid-20s from a Cambahee River rice plantation, sent because she'd been caught teaching other enslaved children to read. Number 12 was a man of about 40 who'd worked as a blacksmith until an owner's death forced his sale to pay debts. Number 19 was a boy of perhaps 15, though Carowway noted that determining precise ages proved difficult given the lack of records. The monkeys he labeled with letters A through L. He kept them in wire cages in a separate room off the main laboratory, where their shrieks and chattering provided constant background noise. The animals frightened easily, throwing themselves against the cage bars when anyone approached. Carowway found their behavior fascinating. Were they responding to some instinctive recognition of danger, or simply exhibiting the general excitability noted in the species? By mid-February, everything was ready. Carowway hired 2 assistants from among the senior medical students: Robert Gadden, whose family owned several James Island plantations, and Thomas Pinckney, a poor white student from the U-Pound who'd worked his way into the college through sheer determination. Both were instructed to maintain detailed records of every observation, every measurement, every response to stimuli. The college purchased the silence of the enslaved subjects through threat and coercion rather than consent. They were told that cooperation meant better treatment, food, and eventual return to their owners. Resistance meant punishment, transfer to worse situations, or sale to the Deep South, where conditions were notoriously brutal. Most chose cooperation, at least initially, having learned through hard experience that resistance rarely improved their circumstances. Carowway began with what he considered baseline observations, measuring physical dimensions, examining teeth and bone structure, testing reflexes and basic responses. He worked systematically, treating the human and animal subjects with the same detached professionalism, noting similarities and differences in his careful script. Number 7 had unusually long fingers, he noted. Monkey F showed signs of previous injury to its left forelimb. Number 12's teeth indicated a harder diet in youth than most of the others. What Carowway failed to notice or chose to ignore was the growing atmosphere of terror in the basement laboratory. The enslaved subjects could hear the monkeys screaming. They could see the instruments laid out on tables, the leather restraints attached to examination platforms, the jars of substances whose purposes they could only imagine. They could smell the fear, human and animal, that permeated the underground space. Number 7 later recalled in testimony given decades after that she knew within the first week that many of them would not survive. He had that look, she said, like we wasn't people at all. Like we was just another kind of monkey to him. Maybe a little different, maybe a little same, but nothing that mattered beyond his numbers and his notes. The actual experiments began on February 23, 1847. Caroway's journal entry for that day notes unseasonably warm weather and his satisfaction with the preparations. Today we commence the comparative study in earnest, he wrote. If successful, this work may revolutionize our understanding of human physiology and settle permanently the questions that have plagued natural philosophy. He had designed a progressive series of tests, moving from simple to complex, from observation to intervention. The first week involved pain tolerance assessments using measured stimuli, pin pricks of increasing depth, exposure to heat and cold, pressure applied to sensitive areas. Carowway would perform identical procedures on both a human subject and a monkey, recording the intensity of stimulus required to produce a response and the nature of that response. The monkeys screamed at even minor discomfort, struggling against their restraints with desperate strength. The human subjects, by contrast, often remained silent even when Carowway increased the intensity beyond what had caused the animals to react. He initially interpreted this as confirmation of his hypothesis that enslaved Africans possessed a fundamentally different nervous system, one less sensitive to pain. What he failed to consider, or deliberately ignored, was that the enslaved subjects had learned through years of brutal conditioning that showing pain led to worse consequences. They had been whipped, beaten, burned, and broken since childhood, taught that crying out brought more punishment rather than relief. Their silence represented survival strategy rather than biological difference. Thomas Pinckney noticed this, mentioning it to Carowway after the third day of testing. "Sir, might we consider that these subjects have been conditioned to suppress pain responses? In my experience on the farm, slaves learn quickly not to show weakness." Carowway waved away the concern. "We're measuring involuntary responses, not learned behavior. The nervous system either registers pain or it does not. Continue recording the data as instructed." By the second week, the experiments had escalated. Carowway began testing healing rates by creating controlled injuries, small cuts, minor burns, arided skin, and monitoring how quickly the wounds closed. Again, he performed identical procedures on both human and animal subjects. The monkeys' wounds often became infected despite the relatively clean conditions of the laboratory. Several developed fevers, requiring Carowway to isolate them to prevent the spread of disease to other specimens. The human subjects' wounds generally healed faster with fewer complications. Carowway noted this triumphantly, seeing confirmation of his theory that different races possessed inherently different physiological capabilities. He did not consider that the enslaved subjects possessed immune systems hardened by years of exposure to harsh conditions, poor nutrition, and constant threat of disease. That their superior healing represented adaptation rather than racial characteristic. Number 12. The former blacksmith tried to explain this to Pinckney one afternoon while Carowway was upstairs meeting with the dean. "Sir, we've been healing from hurts our whole lives," he said quietly, his voice from screaming the day before when Carowway had tested his pain responses with heated instruments. "We had to get good at it, or we'd die young. Ain't nothing special about our blood or our skin. We just got practice at surviving what would kill softer folk." Pinckney included this observation in his notes, but Carowway dismissed it during their review session that evening. "Subjective interpretation from an uneducated subject," he wrote in the margin, "not relevant to objective measurements." As March arrived, bringing the first hints of the humid heat that would soon blanket Charleston. The experiments grew more invasive. Carowway began testing responses to various substances, chemicals, extracts, compounds derived from plants known to have medicinal or toxic properties. He would administer measured doses to both a monkey and a human subject, then record the effects. Changes in heart rate, breathing, consciousness, motor control. Some substances produced violent reactions. Monkey C died after being given a derivative of nightshade, convulsing for 20 minutes, while Carowway took careful notes on the progression of symptoms. Number 8. A woman in her 30s received the same dose the following day. She survived, though she lost consciousness for several hours and woke disoriented, unable to remember her own name for 3 days afterward. Fascinating variation in tolerance levels, Carowway wrote. The human subject demonstrated markedly superior resistance to the compound, suggesting fundamental differences in metabolic processing. Further investigation warranted. What he did not note was that number 8 weighed nearly twice what monkey C had weighed, meaning the relative dose was much lower. Nor did he account for species-specific differences in how primate bodies processed various toxins. His methodology, for all its surface rigor, was fundamentally flawed by assumptions he refused to examine. The students began to grow uncomfortable with the progression of experiments. Robert Gadsden came from a family that owned hundreds of enslaved people, viewing them as property without hesitation. Yet even he found himself disturbed by what he witnessed in the basement laboratory. The screams that echoed through the stone corridors at all hours, the smell of burnt flesh when Carowway tested pain responses with heated instruments, the way some subjects stopped reacting entirely, their eyes gone distant and empty. "Is this really necessary, sir?" Gadsden asked one afternoon in late March, after watching Carowway deliberately break Monkey G's finger to test bone healing rates. "The data we're collecting, does it truly advance medical knowledge, or are we simply confirming what any plantation overseer could tell us?" Carowway fixed him with a cold stare. "What plantation overseers know is based on anecdote and prejudice." "We are conducting science, Mr. Gadsden, controlled experimentation with careful observation and measurement. If you lack the stomach for rigorous inquiry, perhaps you should reconsider your chosen profession." Gadsden said nothing more, but that night he wrote to his father expressing doubts about his continued participation in the study. His father's response arrived a week later. "You will see the work through to completion." The Gadsden name has never been associated with cowardice or weakness of conviction. "Dr. Carowway's research may prove invaluable to our economic interests. Do your duty." So the experiments continued. By early April, 3 of the monkeys had died. One from the nightshade compound, one from infection following a test of surgical wound healing, and one from what Carowway described as general constitution failure after weeks of repeated procedures. The human subjects all still lived, though several showed signs of deteriorating health. Number 19, the 15-year-old boy, had developed a persistent cough. Number 7's hands shook constantly, even when she was trying to remain still. Number 12 had stopped speaking entirely, responding to questions and commands only with nods or shakes of his head. Carowway noted these changes with clinical detachment, seeing them as data points rather than evidence of suffering. His journal entries grew more assured, more convinced that his work would revolutionize medical understanding. He began drafting a paper for submission to the Charleston Medical Journal, outlining his methodology and preliminary findings. The title he chose was Stark Comparative Physiology of the Negro and Samoan Races, a controlled study of pain tolerance, disease resistance, and healing capacity. In his introduction he wrote, "Through careful experimentation, we may finally set aside speculation and establish definitive proof that the Creator fashioned different races with fundamentally different capacities, each suited to their ordained role in civilization's grand design." He showed the draft to Dean Ruddled, who read it with growing alarm. "Edmund, you must be more circumspect in your language," the dean advised. "The findings are valuable, but you're making claims that will provoke controversy. Perhaps frame this as preliminary observations requiring further study." Carowway bristled at the suggestion. Science requires clarity, Horace. We cannot soften our conclusions simply because they make some uncomfortable. The data speaks for itself. The data may speak, Ruddle said carefully, but we must consider how it will be heard. There are abolitionists even here in Charleston who would seize upon your work as evidence of barbarism. Northern journals would crucify you and by extension this institution. Give me time to consider how best to present this to the Board of Trustees. Frustrated but deferring to institutional authority, Carowway agreed to delay publication while Ruddle consulted with the college's board. This delay would prove significant, though not in the way either man anticipated, because while Carowway waited for permission to announce his findings to the medical world, something was stirring among the human subjects confined in his basement laboratory. An impossible plan born of desperate circumstance and the faint hope that perhaps in revealing the full horror of what was being done to them, they might save others from the same fate. Sombras du Pato. The turning point came not from the experimental subjects themselves, but from an unexpected source within Charleston's own enslaved community. Samuel, a house servant who worked in one of the college's administrative offices, had been emptying waste bins and cleaning floors when he overheard conversations that troubled him deeply. He couldn't read the papers he collected, but he recognized names. The names of people he knew from the market, from church gatherings, from the invisible network of communication that existed beneath white Charleston's notice. Number 7 was called Diner among her own people. Number 12 was Marcus. Number 19 was James, and Samuel's wife had known his mother before the boy was sold away from the Goose Creek plantation where he'd been born. Samuel began paying closer attention to the basement activities, listening at doors, watching who came and went, noting the sounds that emerged at odd hours. What he learned horrified him. He understood that something terrible was happening. Even if he couldn't grasp the full scope of Carowway's experiments in Charleston's enslaved community, information moved through channels invisible to white eyes. Messages passed through market stalls and church basement during brief conversations while drawing water or emptying chamber pots. Within a week, several free black residents knew that people were suffering in the medical college basement. Within 2 weeks, that information reached Reverend Morris Brown, one of the city's few remaining black clergymen who'd somehow maintained his position despite increasingly restrictive laws. Brown faced an impossible choice. Going to white authorities would likely accomplish nothing. Enslaved people had no legal standing to complain about their treatment, and the college's experiments, however cruel, weren't technically illegal. The subjects had been rented by their owners for medical purposes, and in Charleston in 1847, that arrangement fell well within accepted practice. But Brown had connections to the small abolitionist community that existed even in the heart of the South. Quakers mostly, some free black professionals, a few white Charlestonians whose conscience wouldn't permit silence. He began carefully, quietly documenting what Samuel and others reported. He needed evidence that could embarrass the college's trustees, make the experiments too publicly shameful to continue, even if they couldn't be legally challenged. Meanwhile, in the basement laboratory, the subjects had begun their own form of resistance. Number 7, Dina had noticed that Carowway kept detailed records of everything, writing constantly in his leather journal and in loose sheets filed in folders. She couldn't read, but she understood the power of documentation. If they could somehow get those records out of the laboratory, perhaps someone could use them to expose what was happening. The opportunity came in mid-April when Carowway caught a spring fever, forcing him to miss 3 days of work. He left instructions for Gadsden and Pinckney to continue basic observations, but to attempt no new procedures in his absence. This gave the subjects their first respite in weeks, time when no one was actively hurting them, time when the students were mainly occupied with cleaning equipment and organizing supplies. Denina had been watching Pinckney for weeks, sensing something different about him, some hesitation that the other student lacked. She decided to risk everything on that instinct. "Sir," she said quietly one afternoon when Pinckney was alone in the room where they were kept between experiments, "You got a good heart. I can see it." Pinckney looked at her, startled. Direct conversation between white men and enslaved women was dangerous for both parties, laden with implications and risks. "You shouldn't speak to me," he said, but without conviction. "I'm going to speak anyway 'cause I got to," Dina continued, her voice low and urgent. "You've been writing in them books, writing everything that happens here. You think what's happening is right. It's science," Pinckney said. But the words came out uncertain. "It's torture," Dina replied. "You know it is. You seen what he does to us, what he done to them animals. You seen how some of us ain't right in the head no more. How James don't even cry when the doctor hurts him 'cause something broke inside. You going to write that down too? You going to tell the world that's what science looks like?" Pinckney said nothing, but his hands were shaking. "There's papers," Dina pressed on. "Papers that tell everything he'd done. You could take them. You could show people. I could be expelled, arrested. My family depends on my success here," Pinckney said, but he was wavering. "And 23 people going to die or go crazy in this basement if you don't do nothing," Dina said. "You got to choose what you can live with, sir. The rest of us don't get that choice." That conversation haunted Pinckney for the next week. He tried to focus on his regular coursework, on the anatomy lectures and chemistry demonstrations that occupied his days above ground. But at night he dreamed of the sounds from the basement, of Monkey G's finger bending wrong, of number 8 convulsing after Carowway administered some new compound. On April 24th, Pinckney made his decision. He waited until Carowway was upstairs attending a faculty meeting, then carefully removed several pages from the doctor's working files, descriptions of specific experiments, drawings showing the apparatus used, detailed notes on subjects' responses. He took only enough to tell the story without leaving obvious gaps that would alert Carowway immediately. He wrapped the papers carefully and carried them out of the college that evening, his heart hammering against his ribs with every step. If caught, he would face expulsion at minimum, possibly criminal charges for theft of valuable research materials. He delivered the papers to his boarding house landlady, Mrs. Elizabeth Simmons, a Quaker widow, who'd occasionally expressed quiet sympathy for the enslaved people she encountered. "I need you to get these to someone who can use them," he told her. "Someone who can make people see what's happening at the college." Mrs. Simmons looked at the papers with growing horror as Pinckney explained their contents. "Dear God in heaven," she whispered, "this cannot be permitted to continue." She knew exactly who needed to see these documents. Angelina Grimm Kay, Charleston daughter of a prominent family who'd moved north and become an abolitionist speaker. Grimke maintained quiet correspondence with several Charleston Quakers, and she had connections to northern newspapers and journals that would eagerly publish evidence of southern medical atrocities. But getting documents from Charleston to Philadelphia in 1847 required careful planning. Mrs. Simmons couldn't simply post them. All mail was subject to inspection, and abolitionist materials were routinely confiscated. Instead, she sent them with a trusted friend traveling north on business, hidden among ordinary correspondence. The papers reached Grimm Kay in early May. She immediately recognized their significance and began working with sympathetic journalists to prepare an expose. But journalism moved slowly in the 1840s. And they wanted to verify the claims before publication to build a case so strong that even critics would have to acknowledge the truth. Meanwhile, Carowway had noticed the missing pages. At first, he assumed he'd simply misfiled them, but as days passed without finding them, he began to suspect theft. He questioned both students sharply, watching their reactions. Gadsden seemed genuinely puzzled by the missing materials. Pinckney's anxiety, however, was palpable. "You wouldn't happen to know where those documents went, would you, Thomas?" Carowway asked coldly one afternoon. "No, sir," Pinckney lied, his voice barely steady. "Perhaps they were misplaced during cleaning." Caroway's eyes narrowed. Perhaps someone with weak constitution decided to undermine work they lacked the fortitude to appreciate. "I'll be watching you very carefully from now on, Mr. Pinckney." The atmosphere in the laboratory grew more oppressive. As Caroway's suspicions festered, he began locking his records in a cabinet and carrying the key with him constantly. He also accelerated his experimental timeline, as if sensing that his window of opportunity might be closing. In late May, he began what he described as invasive neurological investigations, procedures designed to directly examine nervous system structures. He started with the remaining monkeys, carefully dissecting portions of spinal cord to observe differences in fiber density and organization. 4 more animals died during these procedures, their bodies preserved in jars for later detailed study. Carowway announced his intention to perform similar examinations on human subjects, though with slightly less invasive techniques. Dean Ruddle, growing increasingly nervous about the entire enterprise, tried to dissuade him. "Perhaps we have sufficient data already. Edmund, the board is still reviewing your draft paper, and I think it would be prudent to pause new experiments until they render a decision. Science cannot be paused for administrative convenience," Carowway replied coldly. "I'm close to definitive proof, Horace. Another few weeks of investigation, and we'll have evidence that will reshape medical education throughout the South." What neither man knew was that events were already moving beyond their control. In Philadelphia, articles about the Charleston Medical College experiments were being typeset for publication in multiple papers. In Charleston itself, Reverend Brown had quietly documented everything Samuel and others reported, creating a parallel record of the basement atrocities that would prove crucial in coming weeks. And in the laboratory, the subjects themselves had begun to understand that time was running out. Whatever was coming next, they knew it would be worse than anything they'd endured so far. Denina organized the others as best she could, urging them to remember everything, to survive if possible, to bear witness to what had been done. "We got to live," she told them one night after Carowway had left, her voice fierce despite her exhaustion. "Got to live and tell what happened here. That's the only way any of this means something. The only way we can stop him from doing this to others. But surviving would prove more difficult than any of them imagined." The first article appeared in the Philadelphia Public Ledger on June 3, 1847, under the headline, "Horrific Medical Experiments in Charleston College." The report, drawn from Pinckney's stolen documents and supplemented by Grimke's commentary, described in clinical detail the procedures Carowway had performed, the suffering of his subjects, and the fraudulent methodology underlying his claimed findings. The response was immediate and explosive. Northern newspapers seized on the story as proof of Southern barbarism, running editorials that condemned not just Carowway, but the entire institution of slavery that made such experiments possible. "What kind of society," wrote the editor of the Massachusetts Spy, "permits medical men to treat human beings as laboratory specimens, to deliberately inflict suffering in the name of science, to reduce people to the moral status of animals?" In Charleston, the reaction was more complex. Some residents, particularly among the city's small professional class, expressed shock at the revelations. Others, particularly plantation owners and those economically invested in slavery's continuation, defended Carowway as a martyr to Northern interference and abolitionist propaganda. The Medical College Board of Trustees held an emergency meeting on June 8. Dean Ruddle argued for immediately terminating the study and dismissing Carowway to contain the damage to the institution's reputation. But several board members, including 2 prominent planters, insisted that the college must not bow to Northern pressure. "Carowway's methodology may have been questionable," said James Hamilton, Jr., a board member and former governor, "but his basic premise remains sound. Different races do possess different characteristics. Any planter can confirm this through daily observation. We must not abandon inquiry simply because abolitionists have weaponized it for propaganda purposes." The compromise reached was characteristically Charleston. The experiments would cease, but Carowway would be allowed to remain on faculty pending a formal inquiry. The enslaved subjects would be returned to their owners, and the college would issue a carefully worded statement, neither condemning nor defending the research. This solution satisfied no one, Northern papers continued their assault on Charleston's medical establishment. Local opinion fractured along existing fault lines, and Carowway, sensing that his career hung by a thread, made a desperate decision. On the night of June 11th, he returned to the college alone long after the building had emptied. He needed to complete his work before politics destroyed everything. He needed final definitive proof that would silence all critics by the sheer weight of evidence. Marcus, the former blacksmith, was the first subject he selected for what he called terminal neurological examination, a procedure that would allow detailed observation of nerve structures, but that the subject would not survive. Carowway had refined the technique on the last monkeys, developing a method to access the spinal cord and major nerve bundles while maintaining consciousness long enough to test responses. What happened next remains disputed in the historical record. Carowway's journal entries for that night are fragmentary and bloodstained. Pinckney's later testimony described arriving at the college early the following morning to find chaos, and Marcus himself, against all odds, survived to tell his own version of events. According to Marcus' account, given years later to abolitionists in Boston, Carowway strapped him to the examination table around midnight. The doctor seemed agitated, muttering to himself about vindication and scientific truth. He administered a partial sedative, enough to dull responses but not eliminate consciousness entirely. Then he began the procedure. The pain, Marcus said, exceeded anything he'd experienced in 40 years of life as an enslaved man. He'd been whipped, beaten, burned with brands, worked until his hands bled, but nothing compared to the sensation of instruments probing his exposed nerves while Carowway took notes with detached fascination. At some point, Marcus couldn't be certain how long, time having become meaningless, Carowway made an error. Perhaps fatigue affected his normally steady hand. Perhaps the anatomy differed from what he expected based on the animal dissections. Whatever the cause, he severed an artery he'd intended to preserve. Blood sprayed across the doctor's shirt and filled the cavity he'd created. Marcus felt warmth spreading across his back, felt consciousness dimming. Carowway swore and scrambled for ligatures, suddenly desperate to save a specimen who'd been marked for sacrifice. The irony would have been laughable if Marcus had possessed the strength to laugh. Carowway managed to slow the bleeding, but he'd lost control of the procedure. Marcus hung on the edge of consciousness, his body in shock, his survival uncertain. The doctor finally unstrapped him and half-carried, half-dragged him to the recovery area where the other subjects were kept. Dina awoke to find Carowway depositing Marcus' limp form on the floor. "Keep him alive if you can," the doctor said, his voice strange and distant. "I need him alive. The data isn't complete." Then he left, stumbling up the stairs and out of the building, leaving behind a scene that looked like a slaughterhouse. Dina and the others did what they could for Marcus with no supplies, no medical knowledge, only desperate instinct and years of experience patching each other up after punishments. They packed the wound with torn cloth from their own clothing. They kept him warm. They made him drink water when he regained enough consciousness to swallow. And somehow, impossibly, Marcus lived through the night. When Pinckney arrived at the college at dawn on June 12th, he found the basement laboratory in chaos. Blood had pooled on the examination table and trailed across the floor. Surgical instruments lay scattered and unwashed, and in the corner the human subjects huddled around Marcus' unconscious form, protecting him with their own bodies. Pinckney ran to fetch help, his mind reeling. He found Dean Ruddled at the man's home, roused him from breakfast, stammered out what he discovered. Ruddled's face went pale. "Where is Dr. Carowway now?" "I don't know, sir. He wasn't at the college when I arrived." They found Carowway in his rooms, still wearing his blood-stained clothes, his hands shaking as he tried to write up his observations from the failed procedure. He seemed barely aware of their presence when Ruddled demanded to know what had happened. "I needed definitive proof," Carowway said, his voice monotone. "The critics don't understand. They're blinded by sentiment. I needed to demonstrate conclusively." "You've destroyed us," Rutledge interrupted, his own voice harsh with fear and anger. "The board meets this afternoon. There will be consequences, Edmund, severe consequences." Carowway looked up then, and Pinckney saw something broken in his eyes, some disconnection from reality that suggested the doctor might be having a nervous collapse. "The data," Carowway whispered. "I must complete the data." He never got the chance. By afternoon, news of the night's events had spread through Charleston's interlocking networks: medical community, enslaved population, business interests, political factions. The college's trustees had no choice but to act decisively. That evening, they issued a statement announcing the immediate termination of Edmund Carowway's position, the permanent cessation of all experimental research involving human subjects, and a formal inquiry into the events of recent months. They expressed regret for any suffering caused and pledged complete cooperation with civil authorities should criminal charges be contemplated. The civil authorities, however, showed little interest in pressing charges. Carowway had broken no laws that Charleston prosecutors could identify. The enslaved subjects had been used with their owners' permission, for purposes broadly consistent with the rental agreements. The fact that some might find the experiments distasteful didn't make them illegal, but the court of public opinion proved harsher than the legal system. Northern papers published increasingly detailed accounts of Carowway's methods, each article more damning than the last. Medical journals in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York condemned the research as pseudoscientific barbarism that discredited the entire profession. Even some Southern physicians began to distance themselves from Carowway's work, recognizing that defending it made them targets for abolitionist attacks. The final blow came in late June when Marcus, against all odds, still alive, was interviewed by visiting journalists who'd traveled to Charleston specifically to document the scandal. His account of the June 11th procedure appeared in papers across the North, accompanied by editorial commentary calling for international medical bodies to formally censure Carowway and the medical college. The doctor himself seemed to retreat further from reality as the consequences mounted. He refused to leave his rooms, refused to speak with former colleagues, spent his days obsessively reviewing his experimental records as if he might find in them some vindication that the rest of the world refused to see. The formal inquiry began on July 2nd in a stuffy room on the college's second floor, far removed from the basement where the experiments had taken place. Board of Trustees had appointed 3 respected Charleston physicians to review Carowway's work and render judgment on both its scientific merit and ethical implications. Pinckney was called to testify first. He described his months assisting with the research, his growing unease, his eventual decision to remove documents from the laboratory. The panel questioned him sharply about his motivations, his reliability, his potential bias against Carowway. "You stole from your mentor, Doctor," James Moultrie said accusingly. "Why should we trust anything you say when you've proven yourself capable of theft because what he was doing was wrong?" Pinckney replied, his voice steady despite his fear. "I didn't understand that at first. I thought it was just science, just necessary for medical advancement. But watching Number, watching Dinina, watching Marcus, watching James lose himself entirely, I couldn't pretend anymore that this was defensible." "You let your emotions overcome your professional judgment," Moultrie countered. "A physician cannot afford such weakness. Then perhaps I'm not suited to be a physician in a system where cruelty is called science." Pinckney said quietly. The room fell silent. That kind of statement in Charleston in 147 bordered on dangerous radicalism. But before anyone could respond, Dean Ruddle cleared his throat. "Let us focus on the facts of the case rather than philosophical debates. Mr. Pinckney, describe for us the procedures you witnessed in specific detail." For the next 3 hours, Pinckney provided testimony that made even the hardened physicians on the panel visibly uncomfortable. He described the pain tolerance tests, the chemical exposures, the deliberate creation of injuries to study healing. He explained how Carowway had dismissed any suggestion that his methodology might be flawed, how the doctor had seemed to view the subjects as fundamentally non-human. Did he ever express concern for their welfare? One panel member asked. "Only as one might concern oneself with maintaining laboratory equipment," Pinckney replied. He wanted them functional for future experiments. Their suffering itself was merely data to be recorded. Gadsden testified next, corroborating most of what Pinckney had described, though with a more defensive tone. "We were following established scientific protocols," he insisted. "Perhaps, Doctor, Carowway's enthusiasm led him too far, but his basic approach was sound. Many physicians conduct research on subjects who cannot consent. Prisoners, the insane, the enslaved. It's a necessary evil for medical progress and the events of June 11th. The panel chair asked, Would you characterize nearly killing a subject through reckless procedure as sound scientific practice? Gadsden hesitated. No, sir. That was something else, something desperate. On the inquiry's third day, several of the experimental subjects were called to testify. This itself was unusual. Enslaved people's testimony generally carried no legal weight in South Carolina courts, and having them speak publicly about their experiences risked creating sympathy that might undermine the institution of slavery itself. But the panel had decided that understanding exactly what had occurred required hearing from those who'd experienced it directly. They allowed Diner, Marcus, and 3 others to speak, though only in response to specific questions, and with warnings that false testimony would result in severe punishment. Diner spoke first, describing the progression of experiments from her perspective. She was careful, measured, aware that every word might be used against her or others, but she also refused to minimize what had happened. He treated us like we wasn't human, she said simply. Like we was things he could cut and burn and poison just to see what happened. And when we screamed, he just wrote it down in his books like it was no different from noting the weather. Did you at any point give consent to participate in these experiments? A panel member asked. Denina looked at him with something between pity and contempt. Sir, I'm property. Ain't no such thing as my consent. My owner rented me to the college, and I could cooperate or be punished. That ain't consent. That's just different flavors of force. The panel member had no response to that. Marcus testified while sitting. He still couldn't stand for long periods without pain radiating from his back. He described the night of June 11th in quiet factual terms, his voice devoid of emotion, but the bare facts were damning enough. By the time he finished, even Moultrie, who'd been most skeptical of the subject's testimony, looked shaken. Why do you think, Doctor, Carowway did this? The panel chair asked. Marcus considered the question. I think he wanted to prove we wasn't as human as white folk, he said finally. Wanted science to say what he already believed, that we was different enough that treating us different was natural and right. But he went at it backwards, deciding the answer first and then torturing people to make the evidence fit. That observation, coming from an enslaved man with no formal education, struck at the heart of Carowway's methodological failures, more precisely than any learned critique could have. The inquiry's final witness was Carowway himself. The panel had debated whether to compel his testimony, knowing he'd likely be hostile and defensive, but they decided the record needed to include his perspective, his explanation for decisions that seemed increasingly indefensible. He entered the room looking haggarded, his clothes disheveled, his hands still bearing blood stains he seemed not to notice. He refused to sit, standing before the panel with rigid posture that suggested barely maintained control. Dr. Carowway, explain for the panel the scientific justification for your research. The chair began. My work was grounded in established principles of comparative anatomy and physiology. Carowway replied, his voice flat. If different races exist, which no rational person disputes, then documenting those differences serves both scientific understanding and practical application. I employed rigorous methodology, careful observation, and detailed record-keeping. My only error was insufficient political awareness regarding how abolitionist elements would distort my findings. What about the suffering you caused? Ruddled asked quietly. 23 human beings subjected to deliberate pain. 4 animals killed, at least 1 human subject nearly killed through reckless procedure. How do you justify that? All medical advancement requires sacrifice. Carowway said physicians in Paris dissect corpses that were people hours before. Surgeons practice techniques that kill some patients to save others later. The enslaved subjects were going to suffer regardless. At least through my research, their suffering contributed to knowledge rather than being merely incidental to agricultural production. The rationalization was breathtaking in its cold logic. Its complete absence of recognition that the subjects were human beings whose suffering mattered irrespective of any purported scientific benefit. "Do you feel any remorse for what you've done?" the panel chair asked. Carowway looked at him with genuine confusion. Remorse for conducting research? Should surgeons feel remorse for cutting into patients? Should anatomists feel remorse for dissecting cadavers? I performed necessary work that others lacked the courage to attempt. The only thing I regret is the political interference that prevented me from completing a study that might have answered definitively questions that have plagued natural philosophy for centuries. That response effectively sealed his fate. The panel deliberated for just 2 hours before rendering their verdict on July 9, 1847. They found Caroway's research to be methodologically flawed, ethically indefensible, and scientifically worthless. They noted that his assumptions about racial differences had contaminated every aspect of his work, rendering his conclusions meaningless regardless of the data collected. They condemned his treatment of experimental subjects as excessive cruelty, serving no legitimate medical purpose, and they recommended permanent expulsion from the college with a formal suggestion that other medical institutions refuse him employment. The Board of Trustees, desperate to contain the scandal's damage to their institution, accepted every recommendation. Edmund Carowway was officially expelled from the Medical College of South Carolina on July 12, 1847. His name removed from faculty rolls, his papers confiscated and sealed in the college archives where they would remain hidden for over a century. But that wasn't quite the end of his story. Carowway left Charleston on a humid August morning, his belongings packed in 2 trunks, his reputation destroyed, his career in ruins. He'd secured a position through a former colleague at a small rural clinic in Georgia, far from major cities and medical centers, where his past might not follow him quite so closely. The enslaved subjects were returned to their owners over the course of July. Some went back to plantations, resuming the brutal labor that had shaped their lives before the experiments. Others were sold to new owners, their rental to the college having marked them as difficult or damaged goods that original owners preferred to dispose of. Marcus ended up in the hands of a textile factory owner who needed workers capable of operating machinery despite physical limitations. He spent the next 13 years working looms in a Columbia mill before the Civil War's chaos allowed him to escape north. Dina was sold to a mobile merchant family where she worked as a house servant until 1865. She would later say that the domestic work, for all its indignities and constraints, felt like freedom compared to the months in Carowway's laboratory. James, the 15-year-old boy who'd stopped speaking, never recovered from what he'd experienced. He was sold to a turpentine camp in North Carolina where workers died at catastrophic rates. He lasted less than a year before succumbing to pneumonia in the winter of 1848. His death recorded only as a line in an account book. Property loss. Negro boy, age 16, $400. Thomas Pinckney completed his medical degree despite the scandal, though his role in exposing Carowway's research made him a controversial figure in Charleston's medical community. He moved north after graduation, establishing a practice in upstate New York, where he became known for treating patients regardless of race with unusual compassion and respect. He never spoke publicly about his time in the basement laboratory, but his personal correspondence suggests it haunted him for the rest of his life. The Medical College of South Carolina implemented new policies prohibiting experimental research on human subjects without explicit institutional oversight. These policies would be quietly ignored within a decade as the demand for medical knowledge and the availability of enslaved subjects proved too tempting a combination for some physicians to resist. Carowway himself practiced medicine in obscurity for another decade. Records show he moved from Georgia to Alabama to Texas, never staying anywhere long, never regaining the academic position he'd coveted. He died in 1008, 159 in San Antonio of Colera, attended in his final days by a physician who had no idea about his past. His laboratory journals and research files remained sealed in the Medical College archives, forgotten as the Civil War approached, and other concerns consumed the nation's attention. They would stay hidden through Reconstruction, through the Gilded Age, through decades when the questions Carowway had tried to answer through torture were settled through very different means, through the testimony of formerly enslaved people themselves, through the accumulated weight of evidence that all humans shared fundamental similarities, through the slow moral recognition that scientific inquiry could never justify deliberate cruelty. The journals were rediscovered in 1982 during renovations to what had become the Medical University of South Carolina. A construction crew found them in a sealed section of the old basement, preserved in the dry darkness for 135 years. A graduate student in medical history researching the institution's past recognized their significance immediately. The discovery prompted an institutional reckoning. The university organized a symposium on medical ethics, inviting scholars to examine how physicians had rationalized experimental research on enslaved people, prisoners, the mentally ill, and others deemed expendable by society's standards. They published a formal acknowledgment of the 1,847 experiments, naming the known victims and apologizing for the institution's role. But the journals themselves revealed something historians found even more disturbing than the experiment's brutality. They showed how easily educated, intelligent people could convince themselves that cruelty served higher purposes, how readily science could be distorted to confirm existing prejudices, how institutional structures could facilitate rather than prevent ethical catastrophes. In one particularly chilling entry from early April 1847, Carowway had written, "The subjects sometimes watch me with expressions I might interpret as fear or hatred if I believe them capable of such sophisticated emotions. More likely, I'm anthropomorphizing basic animal responses to discomfort. This tendency to project human feeling onto lesser beings represents one of the primary obstacles to objective scientific inquiry." Reading that passage 135 years later, researchers understood with stark clarity how Carowway had maintained his clinical detachment by refusing to recognize the humanity of the people he was torturing, by redefining their suffering as mere animal responses, by hiding behind the language of objectivity and scientific rigor while conducting what amounted to elaborate exercises in confirming his own prejudices. The university's ethics symposium concluded with several recommendations, teaching medical students about the history of exploitative research, establishing strong institutional review boards to prevent future abuses, acknowledging openly the profession's complicity in slavery-era atrocities, and recognizing that ethics could never be separated from science without catastrophic consequences. Of the 23 enslaved people who survived Carowway's experiments, only 3 are known to have lived long enough to give testimony about their experiences. Marcus, interviewed in 1879 by a historian collecting narratives of formerly enslaved people, provided the most detailed account. He was 72 then, still working despite chronic pain from the injury Carowway had inflicted. "I don't tell many people about the months in Charleston," he said. "Most folks don't want to hear it. Makes them uncomfortable. But I think it's important someone knows what happened. What people are capable of when they decide other people ain't really people." Asked if he'd forgiven Carowway, Marcus laughed bitterly. "Forgive? That ain't for me to say. I survived him. That's all I know. Survived when he meant to kill me for his science. That's its own kind of victory, I suppose." Dina, interviewed in 1881, was less philosophical. "He was evil," she said simply, "called himself a man of science, but evil is evil regardless what fancy words you dress it in. And the men who let him do it, who rented us out and turned away when we screamed, they was evil too. Wasn't no one monster. Was a whole system of monsters, all agreeing that what was happening was fine because it was happening to people like us." The third survivor, a woman named Ruth, who'd been number 11 in Carowway's records, refused to discuss the details of what she'd experienced. "Some things don't need repeating. she told an interviewer in 1876. Some things should be forgotten, if that's possible, but I know they won't be forgotten, 'cause the men who did them wrote it all down, made records like they was proud of it. So maybe the memories need to exist, need to stay, so people understand what humans can do to each other when they decide. Some humans don't count as human. The basement laboratory where Carowway conducted his experiments was converted to storage space in 1852, then bricked up entirely during renovations in 1889. For decades, no one entering the medical college building knew that beneath their feet lay the stone rooms, where 23 people and 12 monkeys had been subjected to systematic torture in the name of scientific progress. When the space was finally reopened in 1982, workers found remnants of the laboratory still in place. Rusted instrument tables bolted to the floor. Cabinet hardware from the locked storage, where Carowway had kept his records, drain systems designed to handle the fluids of experimental work. One wall bore faint scratches that might have been messages or might have been random marks impossible to interpret after so many decades. The university debated what to do with the space. Some advocated sealing it again, arguing that preserving it would serve no purpose beyond sensationalism. Others insisted it should become a memorial, a place where visitors could confront directly the medical profession's dark history. The compromise reached was characteristically careful. The space was preserved but not made publicly accessible, available only for educational groups studying medical ethics, always accompanied by historical context explaining what had occurred there and why it represented a catastrophic failure of both science and humanity. The question of what to do with Carowway's journals proved even more contentious. Their historical value was undeniable. They provided detailed documentation of slavery-era medical experiments that had long been suspected but poorly documented. But publishing them raised ethical concerns. Would making them available merely serve to satisfy ghoulish curiosity? Would detailed descriptions of experimental procedures cause unnecessary pain to descendants of the victims? The university ultimately decided to make the journals available to qualified researchers while restricting public access to summary documents that conveyed the historical facts without the graphic details. Even this compromise satisfied no one entirely, but it reflected a genuine attempt to balance historical transparency with ethical responsibility. What the journals revealed beyond the specific atrocities Carowway committed was how completely he convinced himself that his work served legitimate scientific purposes. His entries showed no awareness that he was simply using methodology to justify predetermined conclusions, that he was torturing people to confirm what he already believed. He'd created an elaborate structure of observation and measurement that looked like science, but was actually just organized cruelty wearing science's mask. This pattern, the use of scientific language and methodology to legitimize prejudice and exploitation, would recur throughout American history. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in which black men were deliberately left untreated to study disease progression, the forced sterilization programs targeting poor and minority populations, the radiation experiments conducted on unknowing subjects during the Cold War. Each case involved educated professionals convincing themselves and others that harm inflicted on vulnerable populations served higher purposes. Carowway's experiments represented an early example of this phenomenon, one made possible by slavery's complete dehumanization of its victims. But they also demonstrated something historians found important, that resistance and witness could survive even the most systematic attempts at erasure. Marcus, Dina, Ruth, and others had lived to tell what happened. Pinckney had risked his career to expose the atrocities. Samuel and the Black Community Network had documented and preserved information despite having no official channels for doing so. This resistance, more than the experiments themselves, became the focus of how the Medical University of South Carolina eventually chose to memorialize the events of 1847. Rather than centering Carowway or his pseudoscientific theories, they created educational materials that highlighted the humanity and agency of those who'd been treated as experimental subjects, the courage of those who'd exposed the scandal, and the long process by which medical ethics evolved to prevent similar catastrophes. For descendants of the 23 people who survived Carowway's laboratory, learning this history brought complex emotions. Some found validation in knowing their ancestors' suffering was finally acknowledged. Others felt anger that it had taken so long for the truth to emerge. All emphasized the importance of understanding that what happened wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger system that had treated enslaved people as property to be used however white owners wished. "My great-great-grandmother was number 7, said a woman who contacted the university after the 1982 discovery made news. "We always knew something terrible happened to her in Charleston, that she had scars and nightmares that she wouldn't let anyone touch her back, but we didn't know the details until now. Part of me wishes we still didn't know, but another part is glad the truth is out. Glad people can't pretend slavery was just agricultural work. Glad there's proof of exactly what people will do when they decide some humans aren't human." The medical university's ethics program eventually incorporated study of the Carowway experiments into required curriculum for all medical students. They approached it not as historical curiosity, but as cautionary tale emphasizing how easily ethical boundaries dissolve when professionals prioritize abstract knowledge over individual human dignity, when institutions fail to provide meaningful oversight, when society creates categories of people deemed unworthy of moral consideration. What happened in 1847 wasn't an aberration, one ethics professor told students during a lecture on the topic. It was the logical extension of a system built on dehumanization. Carowway didn't invent the idea that enslaved people could be used however white people wished. He just applied that idea in a medical context. Understanding this history isn't about condemning one doctor from 180 years ago. It's about recognizing the systems and assumptions that made his work possible and examining whether any of those systems and assumptions persist today. That question, whether modern medicine still harbors remnants of the thinking that enabled Carowway's experiments, remains subject to active debate. Research continues to reveal disparities in how pain is assessed and treated across racial lines, how medical experimentation still disproportionately affects vulnerable populations, how the legacy of slavery-era medicine influences contemporary health care practices. The basement laboratory itself stands as silent witness to these ongoing questions. The scratches on the wall, which might be messages or might be nothing, have been preserved exactly as found. Sometimes medical students stand in that space during ethics training and try to imagine what occurred there, try to connect historical atrocity to contemporary practice, try to understand their profession's capacity for both healing and harm. What do you think about this dark chapter of American medical history? Could something like this happen today under different circumstances? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the history of medicine, please share it with others who might benefit from knowing this history. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more deep investigations into America's hidden past, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our journeys into the shadows of history. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that make us most uncomfortable.